I want to tell you something that took me 3 years to fully accept. Not 3 years to research, 3 years to accept. Because once I started pulling this particular thread, once I followed the land records, the estate maps, the Royal Park surveys, and the strange silence surrounding a very specific category of tree, I couldn't put it back. The shape of the thing wouldn't let me. Here is the claim I'm going to make, and I'll make it plainly at the start because I think you deserve that. At some point before the historical period we call the 19th century, an enormous proportion of the Earth's surface was covered in what we would today recognise as food forests, self-sustaining, perennial, producing fruit, nut and medicinal yield without cultivation, without labour, without ownership. And then, in the space of what appears to be a single generation, roughly 1820 to 1880, depending on the region, that system vanished. Not slowly, not through neglect, not through natural succession, but through an act of claiming. A coordinated, continent-spanning act of enclosure so complete, so thorough and so quietly executed that most of us have never once been prompted to ask the question it demands: who decided that the trees belong to anyone at all? I started with a single anomaly. That's always how it begins. I was looking at estate records from the English county of Berkshire, specifically the land transfer documents associated with what are now listed as heritage parkland sites. What struck me wasn't the transfers themselves. Land changes hands. That's history. What struck me was the density of transactions occurring within a compressed window, a period of roughly 40 years in the mid to late 1800s, and the almost complete absence of documentation explaining why these lands were considered transferable in the first place. In English property law, land must have a prior owner, or it reverts to the Crown. Simple enough. But the documentation for these particular parcels, many of them covering hundreds of acres of what the records describe as ancient wood and established orchards, doesn't trace backward the way it should. It simply begins, as though the land had no history before the point of claiming. And here's the strangest part. The trees on these properties were already mature, in some cases extremely mature. We're talking about mulberry trees, walnut trees, sweet chestnut stands, peri-pear specimens that, based on girth measurements taken by Victorian-era surveyors themselves, would have been between 200 and 400 years old at the time of registration. Trees that nobody planted, trees that nobody inherited, trees that, by the logic of all documentation, simply appeared fully grown, already producing at the moment the first owner thought to write their name beside them. This raises a simple but critical question. If no one planted these trees and no prior owner is on record, where exactly did the ownership come from? The official explanation, when you can find one at all, is something vague about customary use becoming formalized or wasteland being brought under management. But the official explanation collapses here because wasteland doesn't produce centuries-old orchards. Wasteland doesn't maintain itself in productive, structured, staggered diversity. Berry shrubs beneath fruit trees, beneath nut canopy, across properties separated by hundreds of miles. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. Before we can talk about who took the food forest, we have to talk about what food forests actually are. Because the modern conception, the permaculture movement's reintroduction of the concept in the late 20th century, obscures something important. We act as though food forests are an invention, a design methodology, something you build. But what if food forests were the default? What if the world's baseline ecological state before the event or transition that alternative researchers have come to call the old world reset was a managed perennial food system so vast, so integrated into the landscape that it didn't require farming in the way we understand farming at all? This isn't as radical a claim as it sounds. Ethnobotanical research, entirely mainstream, entirely peer-reviewed, has demonstrated that what European colonizers described as wilderness across North America, the Amazon basin, and much of sub-Saharan Africa was in many cases a deliberately maintained food-producing landscape. Forests managed across generations through selective planting, pruning, controlled burning, and what we'd now call gilding. Not farms, not wilderness, something in between that our vocabulary doesn't have a clean word for. The deeper I went into the historical record, the more clearly a picture emerged. These systems weren't primitive, they were sophisticated. Sophisticated enough to feed dense populations without the coercive agricultural apparatus, the ploughing, the irrigation infrastructure, the seasonal labour that appears so suddenly in the historical record of almost every major civilization simultaneously. There's a question underneath that observation that I keep returning to. If these systems existed, if they were mature enough to sustain cities, to produce surplus, to operate without top-down management, then what happened to them? And who was positioned to move into the vacuum that their disappearance created? There is a period in worldwide history, concentrated most visibly between roughly 1830 and 1890, that I've come to think of as the window of claiming. In England, the Great Park formations. Hundreds of ancient wooded estates suddenly formalised under single-family ownership, their commons stripped, their access routes gated. In France, the reorganisation of the forêts domaniales, the state forests which absorbed enormous tracts of previously unregistered productive woodland under a central registry in the decades following the Napoleonic administrative reforms. In the German-speaking territories, the consolidation of Banforst, ancient protected forest designations which transferred what had been communal harvesting grounds into noble and eventually state holdings. In the Ottoman territories, the Matruk land reclassifications of the Tanzimat reform period again concentrated in the 1850s and 1860s, which redefined communally used lands as state property eligible for private grant. In North America, the Homestead Acts and their equivalents, which weren't simply about settling open land. They were, in practice, about formalising a claiming system over land that, in many documented cases, already had established productivity, established tree cover, established water management. Land that the documentation describes as empty, but that subsequent land use records reveal was already, in some meaningful sense, arranged. In Australia, the Crown Lands Acts of the 1860s and 1870s. In India, the Indian Forest Acts of 1865 and 1878. In much of Africa, similar legislation written into colonial charters during the same compressed decade. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Same window, same mechanism. The redefinition of pre-existing productive land as either waste, royal reserve, or state forest. Same result, enclosure. And always the same conspicuous silence about what the land was doing and who was using it before the paperwork arrived. Here is where I have to be careful. And I want to be careful, not because the research doesn't suggest something, but because what it suggests is large enough that I don't want to move faster than the evidence takes me. In the course of cross-referencing land acquisition records across 6 countries, England, France, the German states, Russia, the Ottoman Empire, and colonial India, I began to notice a pattern in the structure of the families doing the claiming. Not the specific names, which varied by region, by language, by local political context, but the structure. These were not, in most cases, old aristocratic families with centuries of documented land tenure. Many of them were recently elevated, recently wealthy. Their fortunes appeared in the documentary record with the same abruptness as the land they were claiming, as though the wealth and the land arrived together from the same source at the same moment, and in several cases, traceable through marriage records, through documented financial partnerships, through the interlocking directorates of the colonial-era trading companies, they were connected, not loosely, not coincidentally. Connected in ways that suggest coordination. Across the research community that has begun examining this question, a rough consensus has emerged around the number 13. 13 primary lineages extending outward through branches and intermarriages that appear to sit at the original point of claiming in enough jurisdictions to constitute something that looks structurally like a system. I want to be clear about what I mean by that number. I'm not suggesting a cabal in any dramatic sense. I'm asking a simpler and in some ways more troubling question. Is it possible that the enclosure of the world's food-producing landscapes was not a series of independent regional events, but a single coordinated action, executed through different local instruments, in different languages, under different legal frameworks, but directed by a small enough group of interconnected interests that 13 families is not a conspiracy theory, but simply a rough demographic fact? Because if it was coordinated, if someone or some small number of connected someones recognized what those landscapes were and moved to claim them in a single generation, then we are not talking about the gradual organic development of private land ownership. We are talking about the largest theft in human history, and no one even remembers what was taken. In examining some of the old growth trees still visible in what are now private estates and royal parks, I was struck by something I'd looked at before from a different angle. In earlier research, work I've discussed in a previous episode, I spent time with the transformation of urban green spaces, specifically the old world parks, in the late 19th century. The moment when what had been structurally diverse, multi-canopy productive tree assemblages became the monocultural ornamental parks we know today. The pattern I want to raise here is this. The surviving trees in these spaces, the ancient specimens, the ones that predate the park's official creation by centuries, are almost universally food-producing species. Not ornamental, not specimen plantings, sweet chestnut, walnut, mulberry, medlar, quince, Perry pear, apple. In park after park, estate after estate, across countries and climates, the oldest trees, the ones nobody can explain the presence of, are the ones that feed. Regent's Park in London has mulberry trees that the park's own historical documentation cannot account for. The Bois de Boulogne has chestnut stands of uncertain provenance. The Tiergarten in Berlin contained, before its wartime devastation, fruit and nut specimens that 19th century botanical surveys described as long established without being able to say by whom. These trees weren't planted by the park's commissioners. They weren't planted by the estates that absorbed them. They were already there. And here's where the question becomes genuinely strange. What were they doing there? In the middle of what would become some of the world's great capital cities? Massive, ancient, food-producing trees embedded in urban land that was subsequently surrounded by ornamental planting that doesn't produce anything. Could it be that these surviving specimens are, not metaphorically, not romantically, but literally, the remnants of a food system that once served those cities? That the parks built around them are not green spaces that happen to contain old trees, but old food forests that have been surrounded by lawns, fenced off, declared heritage sites, and slowly rendered inaccessible to the people who might once have depended on them? The evidence suggests something much larger is hiding in plain sight. This brings me to what I think is the most quietly significant development in this story, one that has accelerated markedly in the last 50 years, the designation of protected sites. In country after country, the parcels of land that contain the highest concentrations of unexplained ancient food-producing tree assemblages are now under formal legal protection. Not protection in the sense of public stewardship, not managed commons, not community access. Protection in the sense of restricted entry. UNESCO World Heritage Sites, sites of special scientific interest, royal parks, national trust holdings held in perpetual covenant, private foundations managing historic landscapes, land held by ancient institutions, universities, religious orders, hereditary trusts, whose original acquisition documents are sealed, incomplete, or formally exempt from freedom of information requests. I've spent considerable time attempting to access survey records for a number of these sites. Not to trespass, simply to understand what species are present, in what density, and what the pre-enclosure documentation says, about their use. The answers I received, when I received answers at all, were instructive. For a site in the Wye Valley, I was told that comprehensive species surveys were not publicly available in the interest of preserving ecological integrity. For a series of ancient parkland sites in the Loire Valley, the response from the administering foundation was that historical use records predating the estate's establishment were not held by this institution. For a remarkable concentration of ancient walnut and fruit trees on a private estate in the Apennine foothills of Italy, trees that a 19th century botanical survey described as of indeterminate age and uncertain provenance but clearly cultivated in arrangement, I was told simply that access was restricted, not denied for a specific reason, not subject to appeal, simply restricted. The silence was deafening, and I kept asking myself the same question. Why would the trees need protecting from information? What is it about knowing what grows there and how old it is and what it used to produce that requires restriction? Unless the trees themselves are the evidence, unless knowing what they are, and doing the arithmetic on how old they must be, and asking who was eating their fruit before the first estate map was drawn, unless those questions lead somewhere that the documentation was specifically arranged to prevent anyone from reaching. If you're finding this thread worth pulling, the land records, the heritage site restrictions, the species surveys that can't explain what they're looking at, I'd ask that you share this with someone you think would sit with it, or consider becoming a YouTube member to support the research. The patterns we've been following across this series are only visible at scale. More eyes on this material means more anomalies surfaced, and there are, I assure you, more anomalies than I can cover alone. Let me put the coordination problem plainly, because I think it's the part of this that most deserves to be stated without decoration. For the enclosure of the world's food forest to have been a series of independent, unconnected regional events, organic developments of local economies and legal systems, the following would have to be true simultaneously. Land administrators in England, France, the German states, the Ottoman Empire, Russia, India, and the Americas would all have to have independently arrived within the same 30 to 40-year window at the same legal mechanism. The reclassification of pre-existing productive land as either waste, state property, or privately grantable. They would have to have done this without any documented communication about the policy's world-spanning application. The resulting ownership structures would have to have ended up without coordination, in the hands of a remarkably small number of interconnected families whose financial relationships span those same jurisdictions. And the historical record documenting what those lands were doing before the claiming would have to have been lost, destroyed, or rendered inaccessible in every single case. Not in some cases, not in most cases. In every case I have been able to examine. The deeper I looked, the more this coincidence required explanation. Because a coincidence of this scale and precision isn't a coincidence anymore. It's a pattern, and a pattern has a cause. The official explanation collapses here, not because of a single missing document, but because of the shape of what's missing. You can lose documents through neglect, through fire, through flood. But what we're looking at is a specific category of information: pre-enclosure land use, pre-estate food productivity, pre-claiming community access, that is absent uniformly worldwide across jurisdictions with entirely different archival traditions and entirely different political histories. That kind of absence isn't accident. That kind of absence is architecture. Here is something that deserves more attention than it receives. On pre-1800 maps, particularly the detailed cadastral surveys and estate maps produced by local cartographers before the consolidation period, there is a category of land designation that disappears almost entirely after approximately 1870. In English records it appears as common orchard, town wood, or parish grove. In French records as bois communal or forêt villageoise. In German records as Gemeindewald with the subcategory Obstbaumwald, literally community fruit tree forest. In Ottoman records, there are parallel designations in the Arazi land classification system for productive communal woodland. These designations appear frequently on pre-enclosure maps, frequently enough that in some regions they account for a substantial percentage of the recorded land area. Dense, established, named, productive, and then they disappear. Not because the land disappears, the land is still there, the trees are still there in many cases, but the designation, the legal acknowledgement that the land was communally productive, that it belonged to everyone and no one, that its yield was a commons, that disappears. It is replaced by private estate designation, royal park designation, state forest designation. The transition is documented in the registry. The reason for the transition is not. What would have to be true for this to be simple administrative modernization? You would need to believe that dozens of legal systems simultaneously decided that productive communal woodland was better managed as private property, not because of any documented policy imperative, not because of any recorded community decision, but simply because the administrative language required updating. Or you would need to consider the possibility that someone understood what those lands were, understood what they were capable of, and understood that the first step toward controlling the food supply of a civilization is to establish that the food forest belongs to someone. Not the village, not the city, not the commons, someone. Consider the lineage of the structures that replace the food forests, the private estate, the agricultural empire, the colonial plantation, the royal park, the enclosed hunting ground. Each of these is, in its own way, a transformation of the same thing, productive communal land into controlled private yield. Each required the same first step, the establishment of ownership over land that did not previously require an owner to function, and each, by the time it was established, was in the hands of a remarkably small number of families, whose genealogical connections, if you trace them forward into the 20th and 21st centuries, run through the boards of agricultural commodity companies, through the management structures of world-spanning food distribution systems, through the foundations and trusts that hold the world's largest private landholdings today. This raises a simple but critical question. Is the foundation of modern food economics, the entire architecture of who owns the land that food grows on, built on a claiming event that happened in a single generation in the 19th century by a small enough group of connected interests that calling them 13 families might actually understate the concentration? I'm not asking you to believe that. I'm asking you to hold the question. Because the alternative merit, the comfortable story in which modern land ownership is the natural, gradual, organic development of agricultural civilization, requires you to not look at the maps, requires you to not read the estate formation documents, requires you to accept without examination that what grew on those ancient parcels before the first owner's name was written beside them was simply nothing. Wilderness, waste, common land of no productive consequence. And somehow it just happened to contain the oldest, most structurally diverse, most calorie-dense tree assemblages that subsequent botanical surveys would ever record. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. I want to close this episode not with conclusions, but with a series of observations, things I've seen that I can't explain, things I keep returning to. There is an estate in the English Midlands, I've chosen not to name it, because the access restrictions on its records are already stringent, and I don't want to prompt their tightening, whose parkland contains what an 1847 botanical survey described as an assemblage of fruit and nut species too diverse and too evenly distributed to be explained by deliberate 19th century planting or by any known history of cultivation on this site. The survey author's conclusion was that the assemblage was of unknown origin and great antiquity. The estate was formally registered in 1831. Its first documented owner's acquisition was described simply as a grant of wasteland, an assemblage of unknown origin and great antiquity, grant of wasteland, The official record looked at a food forest centuries old and called it waste. And the person who called it waste then put their name on it. There is a stretch of the Loire Valley in France where, behind the walls of what is now a classified historic property, a 19th century French botanist recorded over 40 varieties of apple, 12 varieties of pear, 7 varieties of quince, and extensive chestnut and walnut stands, all in what he described as a naturally ordered system without evidence of recent planting. The property was acquired by a banking family in 1842. The acquisition documents describe it as undeveloped woodland. There is a hillside in the Apennines. There is a valley in the Caucasus. There are river bends in the American Midwest where the oldest trees are the ones that feed. There are thousands of these sites on every inhabited continent, and almost all of them passed into private hands in the same generation, under the same mechanism with the same silences in the record. And many of the most significant ones are now protected. Not managed, not accessible. Protected. Protected from the question of what they are and what they were and who used to eat from them. I don't know who the 13 families are. Definitively, I have my research, I have the genealogical connections I've been able to trace, the land transfers, the interlocking foundations, the names that appear across too many jurisdictions to be coincidence. But I'm not prepared to name them as individuals because that's not quite the right frame. What I'm prepared to say is this: the world that existed before the window of claiming appears to have operated on a fundamentally different food logic. A logic where the trees produced and the yield was communal and the management was distributed, and no one needed to own a walnut tree for the walnuts to be eaten. And that logic was replaced, not gradually, not organically, in a generation. The deeper I went into this, the more I kept arriving at the same impossible question. Not who took the food forest, though that matters. Not when, though the precision of the window is striking. Not how, though the legal mechanism is fascinatingly consistent across cultures. No, the question underneath all of it is simpler and stranger and somehow harder to face. What did they know that we've forgotten? Because to look at an ancient food forest, to recognize it for what it was, to understand its yield, its self-maintenance, its capacity to feed a city without a plough in sight, and then to claim it, to enclose it, to convert it from commons to private estate, from food system to ornamental park, from productive wilderness to restricted heritage site. To do that in a coordinated way across the entire surface of the inhabited earth, you would have to understand what you were taking. You would have to know, and somewhere, in the files that aren't public, in the surveys that aren't accessible, in the estate records sealed by covenant and the foundation documents exempt from disclosure, somewhere in all of that silence is the record of what was understood and what was taken, and what we have been carefully, efficiently, and very quietly taught to never think to ask for back. The trees are still there, some of them behind gates marked private and fences marked no entry, and plaques marked protected site, still producing, still standing, still carrying, in their roots and their fruit and their impossible age, the memory of a system that fed everyone, without an owner, without a gate.